أحبائي المشاهدين، مرحب فيكم بحلقة جديدة من برنامج بلا قيود. ضيفي هذا الأسبوع هو الدكتور جوردن بيترسون، أخصائي الطب النفسي وأستاذ الطب النفسي في جامعة تورونتو بكندا، ومؤلف الكتاب Maps of Meanings أو خرائط المعاني، والكتاب الذي يصدر هذا الشهر في الأسواق 12 Rules for Life An Antidote for Chaos أو 12 قاعدة للحياة، العلاج للفوضى. Dr. Peterson, I welcome you to Without Shackles, بلا قيود, and I thank you for the time that you're giving us today.
Thanks for coming all the way up here.
All right, so nowadays I hear so much people talking about authenticity, living an authentic life, especially the younger generation, youth. They talk about, I want to live an authentic life. I want to be authentic to myself. I want to live this meaningful life. What does meaningful life mean, first of all? And is there a one sense of meaningful life across time?
Well, there's three questions there. I guess the first one is, what does it mean to live an authentic life? And what that means is to live by truth, essentially. And that means in accordance with the truth that everyone shares, but also in accordance with your own truth. And one of the ways of ensuring that is to be very careful with both what you say and what you do. And you start with what you say. Is don't say things that you know to be untrue. And the reason for that, well, it's twofold. One is you can't help but distort your perceptions of the world if you abide by things that are untrue, because you'll change the way you look at things and the way that you interact with things, even if you don't think you're changing them. The problem with stating things that you know to be untrue is that you inevitably come to act as if they're true, and then you don't live in the world anymore. You live in a counter world or a parallel world, and when they collide, you're going to get hurt. So that's a very bad idea. You also can't tell who you are if you don't attempt to reduce the amount of deception that you're engaging in. I hesitate to say tell the truth, because it's very hard to tell the truth, because you run into the problem of ignorance. You don't necessarily know what the truth is, but people know what a falsehood is, and they abide by them anyways. And it's a very bad idea. The reason people do that is because they believe that they can manipulate the structure of reality in the short term and get away with it, and that there won't be medium to long-term repercussions, or that the repercussions are good. And that's a very naive way of looking at things. You can't alter and distort your relationship with something as all-powerful, let's say, or all-consuming as the entire structure of reality, and hope to get away with it. So that's the authenticity issue. The meaning issue, I think, stems directly from authenticity, which is that if you live out who you are and you attempt to conduct yourself properly in the real world, then the probability that what you'll do, the probability that what you will do will be meaningful is extremely high. Meaning is an instinct in some ways that indicates to people that they're on a track that's working properly in the short term in a manner that will also benefit them in the long run. And if it's meaningful enough, if it's deeply meaningful enough, then it's not only of benefit to the individual now and in the future, but also to other people. And that, you might think, well, why bother? And first of all, it's intrinsically rewarding, far more than anything else you can possibly do. But it's also the only antidote you have to suffering and malevolence, which you're definitely going to be exposed to, both on your own account and as a consequence of interacting with other people. So authenticity is associated with truth, and then meaning is associated with living out that authenticity. And it keeps you positioned in life so that you can at least bear it, and perhaps even find it richly engaging and rewarding along a multitude of dimensions. It's very practical. You know, when people are told, don't lie, for example, it's often like a finger-wagging injunction. You're breaking a rule. And you are breaking a rule, but that's not exactly the point. The point is that you're distorting your relationship with reality. And the probability that that's going to go well for you is zero. One of the prime religious dicta, regardless of creed, let's say, is that life is best characterized as suffering. And then you might say, well, there's two sources of suffering. One is just our innate vulnerability, the fact that we're breakable and fragile, and the other is that we're subject to the malevolence of ourselves and others. And there's no escape from that. There's no way around that. That's the structure of life. So then life has a bedrock element of suffering, tragically and evilly. And then the question is, well, how do you react properly in the face of that? And the answer to that is something like, you aim for something in your life that's of sufficient quality so that the fact that you're subjugated to those things is either acceptable or transcendable, let's say. And in order to do that, you have to figure out what it is that you need and want. And then that has to be made manifest in your actions and your words. And if it isn't, then you're subject to that tragic suffering and malevolence. And then the consequences of that is hellish. Because if your life doesn't have a positive quality to offset the unavoidable negative quality, then you will become bitter and resentful, and then things will get worse. And so it's not merely a matter of making your life better, even though that's very important. It's also a matter of trying to ensure that your life doesn't become as terrible as it might become. And that's the sort of thing that should really give a thoughtful person pause, because your life can become very, very terrible.
Well, let's stop for a second here at the notion of truth. Like nowadays we hear everyone saying, well, I know the truth. I am living by the truth. This is the ultimate truth. So when you talk about truth and you talk about it so much, what kind of a truth, or what is it?
Well, I'm talking more about micro-truths in some sense, rather than the sorts of ideological statements that people make. I mean, are your words in accordance with your being? Do you say things that you know to be false? Do you act out things that you know you shouldn't do? It's very personal. It's not a metaphysical truth or an ideological truth or a philosophical truth. It's micro-truths. Are you clear and genuine in your communications with the people that you love or theoretically love? Because if you're not clear in your communications with them and telling them the truth, then your love isn't worth the paper. Your love isn't real, and your love isn't real. It isn't there at all. It's just a facade. And so Carl Jung said once that modern people don't see God because they don't look low enough. And what he meant by that was something like what I meant by this idea of micro-truths. It isn't the grandiose slogans that characterize people in public and their sweeping displays of morality that indicate the manner in which they live. It's the small things they do, the hypothetically small things they do that they repeat every day, that actually make up their lives, that are actually important.
People love this notion of truth and they want it in their lives. And they can tell you like all the time that this is all I care about, truth. But the truth is that we run away from the truth because we are afraid to show who we are. We are afraid to be who we are. We are afraid to show our vulnerability.
Well,
so how do we deal with that?
Well, there's two aspects to that. One is that there's a fair bit of responsibility associated with taking on, let's say, the burden of trying to live an authentic life. And so there's every reason to avoid responsibility because it's onerous and difficult. Now, the alternative to that is pointless inactivity, which is death for people. So it's not like avoiding that actually works, although moment to moment it's easier. And then with regards to the truth, the problem is that most of the time when you learn something new, so let's say that's part of living a truthful life, is that the willingness to learn something new so that you can rectify your errors, is that you almost always learn painfully. And so Nietzsche said, for example, that you could characterize the depth of someone's spirit by noting how much truth he was willing to tolerate. And that's it's a really interesting take on the problem, because people think the truth will set you free, and that's a biblical axiom. But the problem is that it tends to drag you through the mud and burn you up before it sets you free. Truth, you almost always learn true things about yourself painfully. Not always, Now and then you find a capacity that you didn't know you have, and it's realized, and you're better at something that you thought you might be, and that's all well and good. But very frequently you learn by banging your head against something and then noticing that you were at fault for the banging. And people don't like that. It means they have to take themselves apart and determine why they were motivated to walk down that path. And there's often ugliness at the bottom of that. Sometimes that's even multi-generational in scope. You know, you're acting out some irritation that your grandmother had with your grandfather because they had an abusive relationship, and that behavioral pattern is being passed down the generations and you don't even know it. So it's tremendously messy work it's like surgery for infection. It's necessary, but it's by no means pleasant, especially not in the short term.
You said something, Dr. Peterson. You said to live a meaningful life, live out who you are. And that's like as if each one of us is an expert of who we are. People don't know we don't know who we are. And I don't think we report ourselves objectively or honestly. We don't know why we're angry. We don't know why we do the things that we do. We don't know why we react the way and we run away from our pain. So how can we know who we are?
Well, you do that partly by expressing it. It's a process of discovery, right? I mean, when you react emotionally to something, say with anger, it's a low resolution representation of the situation. Something didn't fit right. Something isn't working out the way it is, but it's not immediately obvious why. You have to go through the difficult process of thinking it through, and you often have to do that with another person. That's partly why it's so important to leave speech untrammeled in a society that hopes to function properly, because without the capacity to say what you think, even badly, you can't figure out who you are, and then you can't figure out what you should do, and then you can't figure out how to live in a manner that will enable you to tolerate life. And then things go downhill from there. So yes, people are too complicated to understand themselves, but we can do it pretty nicely with dialogue.
Do you think dialogue is enough to take us like down the road to what really shaped us and conditioned us as as children and growing up to know exactly who we are? Or is there another way to get to know oneself? Because you always quote Jung saying, if you don't know who you are, you will end up acting out a tragedy.
Yeah, that's right.
So how can people know who they are? Is there an easy way for them, to know who they are and why they react the way they react?
Some of it has to do with admitting to the presence of emotions. If you see someone who's doing well, maybe a family member, and that makes you resentful, which is very common, then it's very unpleasant to admit to that, but it's very much worthwhile to notice it and then to think, wow, I'm not happy that my brother is doing well. What does that say about me? Why am I unhappy? What should I do about it? It's the willingness to notice often uncomfortable emotional states, and then the additional willingness to delve into them for understanding. And you won't do that unless you believe that becoming clear about such things is going to be useful, assuming you want things to be better. You won't be convinced of that unless you believe that investigating those sorts of emotions can lead to something good, and you want something good, you won't be able to put in the moral effort necessary to do it. But if you notice your life and you notice that it isn't going as well as it should, and that you're not as strong as you might be, and that things hurt you more than you can bear, and that you're anxious and unhappy, then you might ask yourself, well, perhaps there are important things that I don't know. And then you can start paying attention to the emotional reactions you have that aren't pleasant, in the hope that you'll learn something from them. Like, imagine that you have a disagreement with your husband or wife, and that's unpleasant. It's unpleasant because of the emotional tension around the disagreement. It's also unpleasant because you might be wrong. And so your primal motivation is going to be to defeat the other person in the argument. But if you note the negative emotion and you accept the fact that you might be wrong and you listen, and the other person can tell you in what manner you were wrong, then you don't have to repeat the same mistake forever. And so that's, part of it is a matter of getting your fears in proper order. You should be more afraid of propagating a mistake across time than you should be of facing the consequences of a mistake in the present. That's wisdom, right? It's no picnic to see how error-ridden you are. And that manifests itself in anxiety and resentment and doubt and anger and all those emotions that people find, well, sometimes self-righteously thrilling, but usually negative. But if you understand that you delve into that and that the reward for straightening it out is that you don't have to run into the same brick wall face first every day for 30 years, then you can motivate yourself to listen and to learn, even when it's unpleasant. The consequences of not doing it are more unpleasant, so that's a good thing to realize.
Do you think really that each one of us, every person, has the ability to notice themselves and catch the true feelings that are working inside of us, and especially the negative feelings, and stop themselves? Or what is it, on the other hand, that hinders us from catching these feelings and not be able to change?
Well, I think that everybody has the capacity to stop saying things they know to be untrue. And that's a really good start. You know, people are going to differ in their capacity to articulate and express themselves, but they are going to also articulate and express themselves in a variety of means. Some people will do it linguistically in a very articulated way. Some people will do it artistically. Some people will do it through caring for others. You know, there's lots of different ways that an authentic life can be manifest, and not all those are necessarily verbal or intellectual for that matter. But a huge part of it is the desire to do so, the desire to get things straight. And that's associated with the idea, that's a very deep religious idea in some sense, that you should orient yourself to the furtherance of being, that your proper attitude towards life is that you want it to be better, that you want to improve it. And then you also take on the burden, let's say, of deciding not to engage in deception, knowing full well that the use of deception makes things worse. And so, yes, I think that people can move ahead with that from a moral perspective, regardless of their intellectual abilities. So, and I mean, if you look at classic religious ideation, in Christianity, for example, there's an idea that redemption is a universal possibility. It's independent of your intellectual gifts, or of any gifts for that matter.
So what does it mean, or how is it that if we do not know who we are carrying out a tragedy?
If you aren't acting out who you are, you're acting out something else. And unless you know what that something else is, you better be careful. If your existence is predicated on a tissue of lies, then you're essentially in the hands of the generator of lies. And there's great mythological representations of the generator of lies. You know, that's let's say, psychologically speaking, the symbolic representation of the generator of lies is a satanic figure. And if you're acting out a life of lies, then that's whose hands you're in. It doesn't matter if you're a believer or not. These are psychological realities as well as potentially metaphysical realities. And if you're in the hands of something that wants nothing good for you, you better look out, because that's exactly what you'll end up with. And, you know, people know that to some degree. When they decide to act in a false manner, there's a voice in the back of their head that utters a warning, and they often say, "To hell with it, I'm not paying attention to that." It's like, well, fair enough, but you won't get away with it, because people don't get away with anything, as far as I can tell.
Do you think that people have the ability to align themselves on their own?
I don't know if they have the ability to align themselves on their own, but there are very few people who are on their own. You know, we're very social creatures, and I think that in concert with other people who are well-meaning, you can go a long ways to putting yourself together. You know, if you have people around you that you trust and that you can talk to, then that buttresses the places where you happen to be weak. So I do believe that people have the capacity to put their lives together to a far greater extent than they often do. But the people that are writing me, and it's mostly young men, I would say, not only, they say, well, they say something like, my life was really terrible. I was nihilistic and depressed. But they also say, but I wasn't really trying to do anything. I wasn't really doing anything. I didn't have any direction or goals. And so now I've started to put an ethic into practice, and lo and behold, it really works. Well, so a lot of it's low-hanging fruit. If you're not going anywhere, just deciding to go somewhere can improve your life a lot. If you're deceiving yourself all the time, just slowing that down to some degree can start to produce some radical improvements. I think that people have a lot more potential than, especially ethical potential, than is immediately self-evident.
How can people embrace nihilism in their lives when they're still going about every detail and aspect of their life and make you feel like I am living life and I love life, but they, at the same time, like you see that, what is nihilism in this case?
There's two forms of it, I suppose, and one is really the act of giving up at the level of action, right? And just not engaging in life at all. That's a real deep nihilism. The more shallow nihilism is to continue to engage in life, but to put forward an explicit philosophy that is predicated on the idea that life is ultimately meaningless and futile. Now, that's, I would say, less profoundly disquieting, because what someone believes is really manifest in how they act. What they say, especially about themselves, in some sense is secondary. It's not like what they say is unimportant. It's not that. But their deeper convictions are manifest at the level of action. And lots of people who say they're nihilistic are just confused about the nature of reality from an ethical perspective. They act ethically, but they can't figure out a rationale for it. And so they adopt a philosophical nihilism, but keep acting as moral agents. The really deep nihilists become hopeless. And some of that is because they fall into a logic trap. You know, it's something like, well, in a million years, who the hell's going to know the difference? So why should I do anything at all? It's something like that. And it's also attractive to some degree, because the advantage to nihilism is that there's no responsibility associated with it.
So it's a way to run away from responsibility?
Yes, I think people often portray nihilism as an inevitable hopelessness, but they fail to take into account its attractiveness. And the attractiveness is, oh, well, if my life is meaningless, then I don't have to do anything. Now, it turns out that that's a real catastrophe, but you can also understand it as it has its attractions.
Can people fall into this trap without knowing that this is what, like, they feel that their life is meaningless and they act, I don't care about anything in the world. So how would you prompt their attention to know that they're coming from a place where their own life does not matter for them?
Well, the first thing is that it's rarely the case that someone doesn't care. What is the case is that their cynicism has undermined anything positive in their life, but it hasn't undermined the negative. So the first thing you do with someone who's nihilistic is say, what makes you so sure you don't believe in the reality of your own pain? And that's a very good question, because you can talk all you want and you can be as cynical as you can possibly manage, but using that as a weapon against anxiety and pain is it just has no effect at all. Cynical nihilism can destroy happiness, but it can't destroy misery. And you might say, well, I don't believe that life has any meaning. That isn't what you mean. You mean, I don't believe life has any positive meaning. You're not going to get out of the negative meaning. And then the next question is something like, are you sure that you're so satisfied with the fact that your life consists of nothing but negative meaning? Is that really working out well? You say, well, I don't believe in anything. It's like, yes, you do. You believe in your own pain. Everyone believes in their own pain. And what that means is that you'd also have to believe in the antidote to that pain. And maybe you'd be happy to find it.
In your book that came out in January, you talked about 12 rules of 12 rules for life, and you consider these rules as an antidote to chaos. Do you care to explain a little bit, like, what kind of rules that really can be a cure to the chaos? And are you talking about the inner chaos?
Both, because I don't think there's any real difference between inner chaos and There's no difference between individual chaos and familial chaos and societal chaos. It's the same thing. It's just manifesting itself at different levels of analysis. And while structure is an antidote to chaos, predictability, routine, a negotiated arrangement so that we come to a mutual understanding with one another. That's all structure. That's an antidote to chaos. And it's not trivial either. It can be a matter of life and death. So structure is one antidote to chaos. And then another antidote to chaos is to learn how to dynamically interact with chaos. So you have two modes of self-protection against the fundamental chaos of life. And one is healthy structure, and the other is the capacity to dynamically interact well with structure and with chaos. A competent person is someone who's like that because they're disciplined. That's the structure. But they're also capable of confronting new situations and mastering them. And to be properly socialized, let's say, you have both of those operating, and both of those should be facilitated. That's why in the Trinity, there's two of the elements of the Trinity are a Son and a Father. A Spirit, say three, a Spirit, a Son, and a Father, but we could go for just two. The Father is structure for all intents and purposes, and the Son is the thing that renews the structure. So, and you need to be aligned with both of those. So, this is one of the problems with moral relativism. So, moral relativism. One rule can be exchanged for another. Yes. Here's something that isn't exchangeable. The necessity of rules. There's the absolute. It's necessary to have a set of rules. There's nothing relativistic about that. It's the case for every human being for all time. Now, the rules obviously are somewhat interchangeable. There's lots of sets of rules that can function as guides in the world. And one certainty is, if you live by no rules, then look out, because you're a catastrophe to yourself and a danger to everyone else. And that's a moral absolute. So part of the book idea is, well, you need to live by some rules. And so here's 12 that I've deeply considered, and a rationale for all of them. And
what is the one that is the most precious to Dr. Peterson as a clinical psychologist and as a professor of psychology?
Well, one of the rules is tell the truth, or at least don't lie. That's a good start. That's a good start. You can get a long way with that one. Like just to try for a month not to say anything that you know to be false that makes you weak is a life-transforming experience for people.
How about manipulation? People manipulate. They don't lie, but they manipulate.
It's the same thing. Doesn't matter whether you say it or act it out. It's the same thing. There's some really subtle manipulation. So if I'm really good at deceiving you, I'll do it with truth. Like I'll tell you something true in a manner that serves my purposes. So it's a truth nested inside a deception. That's what you do if you're really sophisticated at lying. And people do that all the time. And they say, well, I told you the truth. It's like, well, the sentence was true, but the paragraph was false. So no, you don't get to engage in that either. You're supposed to try to not say anything you know to be false.
I've enjoyed so much talking to you, and I'm sure my audience have enjoyed so much listening. They have learned so much today, and they have so much work ahead of them to do after listening to all these valuable thoughts and advice on how to go about life. I thank you so much, Dr. Peterson, for this time.
Well, thank you for coming up here and taking all the time and putting all this effort into it. So it's my pleasure.
أحبائي المشاهدين، حلقتنا لليوم انتهت. على أمل لقاء جديد، بترككم مع بركة الرب يسوع.